Supabase is an open source Firebase alternative that I highly recommend. You can manage your authentication, even adding OAuth providers so we can sign in with GitHub, Google, Discord, and all of the others, and even managing files and storage blobs and various other things as well. So everything that you have in Firebase or anything you need for your database, you can use it in Supabase. Today we're going to check out how we can build a site like this, which is essentially a very basic to-dos, because what we're going to be learning is how we can add Supabase Auth to our NextJS application using server-side code. So what we're going to be using is NextJS server actions as well. So how we can link up all of these forms with server actions, and how we can add buttons like this so we can log in with GitHub. And then once we log in with GitHub, what you'll notice is our to-dos. And the other thing we're going to explore as well is using these server actions, how we can use the new React hooks, so useFormStatus, so that we can show essentially states. So if we add a new to-do here, so let's say hello world, like so, you'll notice this grays out while it's essentially sending off and confirming with the database that it's done. And then we're also going to use useOptimistic, which is how you saw that it immediately added there. And if we click delete, even if the server hasn't deleted it yet, we show the user essentially optimistically that it has been deleted. So let's jump into it. To get us started, what I actually have here is some example code for essentially the bare minimum for a to-do app, except it doesn't have the functionality, obviously, of actually working or anything here working. But this is how we're going to implement Supabase and the Next.js form actions, just with this as a starting point, as I don't want to cover, obviously, creating components and stuff, as that can be handled in a separate tutorial. This tutorial is just going to focus on adding Supabase login and the database to this, and then using some of those Next.js form actions, useFormStatus and useOptimistic, to make our website feel really good from that server-side point of view. So to get started, what we're going to want to do is create a project in Supabase. So log in or sign up to Supabase, hit new project, and then choose your organization. For this, we're going to give it a name. So for me, I'm going to give this Super To-Do. Generate a password here, and then save that to a password manager. As it says, this is going to be your database password for Postgres. And then for your region, select a region that's close to where you're actually going to be hosting your website itself. Hit create new project, and this is going to go ahead and link us to the dashboard for this project. And then we're going to wait here until this setting up project bit is complete, and then this page should change. Okay, now that that's complete, your project should start to look like this, and it should say welcome to your new project as it's been all set up for us. One of the first things we need to do is create some tables for it. So you can actually use the table editor here if you want sort of a nice GUI to set that all up. But for us, we're going to be using the SQL editor, as we're going to be using the same SQL, so you can follow along with me, having the exact same database. Now, you can actually use quick start and to-do list for this. This should build out the exact same one. But I'm going to go ahead and paste in some SQL just to make sure that I've set up earlier for this application. So if we do a new query here and paste this in, what you'll see is we're creating a to-dos table. We're going to be using an ID with an integer just as our primary key. Then we're going to have a user ID bit. Now, what you might know is we haven't set up an auth.users table, but Supabase actually does this for us, and it has an auth.users table that we can reference. So user ID here is always going to be a user that has been set up with Supabase authentication, and we'll handle that bit in the next step. Now, task here is just, again, it's just going to be a string. So this is actually the task bit that we set up. And then is complete is the Boolean for that checkbox there. And then inserted at, again, is going to be another default that's just going to use the time of now of when it's been inserted with UTC. The really important bit to know on this bit is this row level security here. When you're using the SQL editor or you're doing any migrations or something, if you're using this bit, it won't have row level security enabled by default, as Postgres doesn't. If you use the table editor here, Supabase will actually turn this on for us. Row level security is essentially how we're going to be checking whether the user actually has access to the rows in that database and whether they're able to perform some actions on this. And this is where we then set up our policies here. So you'll see with create policy, we have the individual can create a to-do. So we're just going to check that someone has an auth.uid to make sure they can actually create something in our database, as we don't want someone who doesn't have an authenticated user to be able to create anything in the database. Then we're going to do some checks for whether they can view, create, and update or delete their actual to-dos here. So this is just going to be selecting the auth.uid and equals to the user ID. Really cool thing about this is you'll see later when we go ahead and call to get the to-dos in our application, we don't actually have to pass through the user ID, as the database knows once we do that get call and the user has a session in our Next.js application, but that's all they have access to, so that's all it can return. So that's really cool. Once you've got all of this set up, we're just going to hit run here, and that's going to say success, no rows, return. And that's because we go back into our table editor here, you'll now see that we do have that to-dos table set up. The next thing we can note as well is if we go to authentication and if we click into providers, by default, Supabase always enables the email provider for you. And you'll see in the email provider, you just have some settings here. The one I want to note here is confirm email. Confirm email, this is essentially, we're going to be setting this up. So when someone signs up with an email address, it sends off obviously an email to them and it has a confirm email link in there just to make sure they're a verified email and it's not spam. The important thing to know about this is you will need to bring your own SMTP server at some point. For development, Supabase only gives you 3 in a day, which is a bit limiting. So I do recommend if you're testing a load of signups to turn off this confirm email step. I'm going to leave it on as we're only going to be setting up one user. And I know that we're going to have that confirm email bit sent back and we want to test that part of the chain as well. But as I said, you will have to look into setting up your own SMTP server later on, or you can just turn off email completely and then follow the next steps where we set up an OAuth provider so we can use stuff like Google, Discord, and GitHub to sign in with our application instead, meaning you don't have to manage any of this. But we'll go ahead and close that for now. The last bit that I do want to do as well is if we go into the sidebar here, you can go down to API docs. Now, Supabase docs are honestly really amazing. They have so much content and so much help for you. So you can even click on your tables and views and it will essentially tell you all of the functions that you can perform on it and how to do that. The one I want to know is if we go to introduction here on tables and views, we have this part on generating types. So if you're using TypeScript, you can actually go ahead and download a file which is all of the types that you're going to need, or you can set it up from the Supabase command line interface. Now, I'm actually just going to be hitting this generate and download types here because I know that I'm not going to be changing my database as we've already set that up, and I know that this is the one that we're going to be using for to-dos. If you're doing a lot of development, so you're adding tables as you go, you may want to set up this Supabase command line interface to generate this file for you. The last thing we need to do is if we go to home and we scroll down here, you should see it says connecting to your new project, and it's going to have that project API here where we have a URL and an API key. We now need to implement this in our application. So we go into our super-do-do. As I said, this code here will be in the link in the description. So you can go ahead and get started from this. This is going to be on a branch called start, as the master branch will be everything that we do today. And you can follow along with my commits. They should match up with the YouTube chapters as well, so you can see what's changed in each section. First thing we're going to want to do here is you're going to want to copy and paste your env.local here, or env.example, to a file here called env.local like I have. And then you're going to want to copy and paste in those values instead. So what you've got here is the project API, which is that project URL. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this in like so. And then the API key as well. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that in and replace the one that we had in there. And there you go. You're now set up to use your env variables with Supabase there. As it does note here, the key is safe to use on the browser. As with Supabase, what you'll see in a minute is we set up 2 different types of clients. We're only going to be using the server client for this, but technically you can use the browser to call off to Supabase to make changes for you. I personally don't like doing that, as I like to essentially hide where our database is and hide it behind these actions like server actions. And this is sort of a similar pattern you'll see is where you implement your own API, which then goes off and calls the database for you. It's just a nice way to essentially hide where the actual database is and hide the database functions themselves. And it also allows you to switch out the database later on, as you only have to change your API endpoints. Now that we've got that, let's move on to step 1, which is essentially setting up Supabase within our application. Now to do that, as I said, Supabase's documentation is really awesome. We're going to be going to this link here, which is docs/guide auth/server-side-nextjs. This will be a link in the description down below. Now this genuinely has everything that we need to get set up with our application. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop the server for a second as I have the site up and running. We're going to install the packages. So I'm going to be using pnpm. That's going to be the Supabase at Supabase/SupabaseJS and at Supabase/SSR. The next step here is it's going to tell you to set up your environment variables, which we've done. But if you haven't done that already, you can actually literally just select your project down here and it will give you the exact environment variables we need. So you'll see it will have them selected there for either demo project 1 or that super to-do that we have there. Next, we need to write our utility functions. As I mentioned earlier, we have that client component, so to access it from the client component, you need to set up that client-side one, or we set up the server one. To do this, we're going to scroll down though, and as I said, we're going to be ignoring this client.ts as we're only setting up the server-side client, as that's the only one I want to be using in this application. To do that, we're going to go into our utils folder. You're then going to go into a folder called Supabase, which you can create, and then you're going to add server.ts. Inside server.ts, we're literally just going to copy and paste this code here. Essentially what this code here is doing is it's just creating a Supabase client for us, and it's going to go ahead and get those environment variables for us, and then it's also going to handle doing the cookie authentication for us. So this bit is just making sure that we have that cookie store, and then we're getting and setting the operations for us. The next bit we need to do is hook up middleware. So middleware is how we're going to be handling when someone goes to a page. We essentially need to change that request to attach a cookie onto that to make sure they're a verified user. And since we're using server components as well, we need it to be refreshing and checking every time we go to a page just to make sure that the user is always authenticated. To do that, we go into our Supabase first, and then we add another new file called middleware.ts. For this, again, scroll down past this bit here. You'll see this utils/Supabase/middleware bit, and we'll go ahead and copy and paste this code as well. As I said, essentially what we're doing here is we take in the next request, which will be passed from the middleware. We go ahead and get the cookie if we can, or we go ahead and set the cookie as well. And this bit here is quite important for server-side components. Essentially what this is doing is making sure on every request, we make sure we re-authenticate that user. And that's just really useful for NextJS server-side, as it stops it being cached and not authenticating them correctly. So you do need that line there. As I said, luckily that documentation has that all set up for us. The last bit that we need to do is, outside of everything here, you need to then create a new file called middleware.ts. So this is the actual NextJS middleware file. So this is going to be at your root level, and you only allow one of these per NextJS application. But again, this is essentially the NextJS middleware file, and this is the bit that tells NextJS on every request to go ahead and call our Supabase function. So again, we can copy that code and paste that in, and you'll see here that our middleware function is literally returning just the await of the update session function that we just created in that Supabase middleware file. The next important thing to note is this matcher here. At the moment, for the attaching the cookie, we're essentially making sure that there can be an authenticated user, or at least that the user cookie is available on every single page. You can change this for your needs, but essentially what this is doing is ignoring, however, the files such as the favicon and then various image files, as we don't need it on there. And as I said, it explains it here, what it's doing. It's saying match everything except static files, image files, and the favicon. You can modify this to however you need. For our purposes, we do not need to modify this. So now that we've done that, the last thing that I'm going to want to do is remember that Supabase file that we downloaded earlier. We go ahead and drag this into a folder called types. You'll see that we now have types, and then we have supabase.ts. And you'll see, as I said, you can generate this from the command line or use the download. As I said, as we know we're not changing it, we're going to be using the download. But what you're seeing here is it has all of the TypeScript that we need for our Supabase database. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and commit everything that we've just changed there as step 1 Supabase setup, so you can follow along with the GitHub commits and the chapters. Next bit we're going to move on to is how we can actually set up the email sign up and the email login, and then we'll follow that on with setting up OAuth login, and we're going to be using GitHub, but you could use things like Google, Discord, and a number of others. So for setting up email sign-in, what we can do is we can stay in this same documentation page on Supabase, and you'll see it'll actually have a section to create your login page. We've already done that in this example app that I have. If we go into app login, you'll see that we have a page here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run the dev server real quick so we can see some of our changes pull through as we go. So what you'll see is we have this page on /login here. So if I click the sign up button, and once that's logged in, we have this login page here. And at the moment, the form obviously isn't going to be working even if we fill this out, as we don't have it hooked up to anything yet. Let's go back to the documentation and see what it recommends us to do. The first thing is we need an app/login/actions.ts. As I said, since we're using NextJS server actions, this is going to be the recommended method to do this. So you're going to do actions.ts. Now, if you're calling any actions from a client component, essentially what you need to do is have a separate file with this useServer directive. If you're using server components, you can actually inline the function and then put useServer at the top line of that function. I generally recommend and prefer just having all of our server functions or server actions in a separate folder or file called actions.ts. And I also prefer to locate this essentially next to all of the pages that are going to be using it. Now that we've done that, we can actually go ahead and copy and paste the code in this actions.ts login. I'm going to change a few things about this, but just to go through it, essentially what we have is when we have a login function, and I'm just going to quickly change this to email login as well, so we can have it clear between our OAuth login when we add that later. What we do is, using a server action, we send through some form data. So for us, that form data is going to be email and password, and that's based on the name of the input fields that I have set up here. So when we submit that, it's going to have email and password, and it's just going to run off and do formData.get. So it comes in as this form data object, which React has. Once we do that, we do formData.get just to check the emails there. Now this can actually be string or null. So, it says there, it can be form data entry value or null. We're going to typecast this. As they say here, in practice, you should probably be validating this with a library such as Zod. So you'd use something on your form, such as React Hook Form library, and then Zod, and validate that schema. And then also do Zod.parse on this side, just to check that everything matches up. Since this is a really simple form, I'm pretty happy with just typecasting this at the moment. As I said, if you're doing some more complex database stuff, maybe consider looking into some form validation methods. Next bit here is it then goes off and says await Supabase.auth, sign in with password, just passing through our email and password there. All we're doing is using object destructuring here to get an error. There is also a data object on this, but we don't need that, as essentially we don't have to do anything with the passback data from sign in with password. We do, however, have to check if there's an error with logging them in or something. So that could even be just, let's say, a wrong password. Now, the way they do it is they recommend pushing them to a /error page. For essentially easier sake on doing this tutorial, what I'm going to do is instead of sending them to an error page, I'm going to send them back to the login page, but I'm going to add a message using search params, and that for me is just going to be could not authenticate user. So if there is an error with logging them in, it goes back to this login page, but it adds a search param, which we'll then use later, and I'll show you that. The next bit that's really important is this revalidate path. So this is revalidating the path / at the layout level. Essentially what this is doing is just clearing the cache for everything. So it purges all of the cache data on demand for pretty much everything as we're using that / and that layout there. And that just makes sure that when we do sign in, all of the cache is cleared, because now we need to get new cache entries with the user being authenticated. And you can also add this redirect here once that logged in. For us, we're going to change this redirect, so when that logged in, it goes straight to that to-dos page. Same thing with the sign up here. You'll see we have that same structure. Essentially, the only difference here is we're loading up the sign up function here from Supabase. Now, an important thing to note is every time you use Supabase, you use this create client function. This create client function is actually coming from the Supabase server file we set up earlier down here. Lastly, again, with this message bit here, I'm going to change this again to the login page, and then I'm going to add a search param. And I'm just going to do, let's say, error signing up. And then again, with the redirect here, you can change where you want to redirect this to if they hit login. I'm going to, again, redirect it to just the /login page, so that if they do hit sign up, they don't go back to the start page. They stay here, because they may need to go ahead and confirm that email, and then they can come back to this page here to log in once that step is complete. So now that we have both of these functions set up, we can go ahead and add them. But another thing that we're going to want to do is when they hit the sign up button, as I mentioned, it's going to go ahead and call off a different function, which essentially sends them an email with confirm email. To do that, what we actually need to do is firstly go back to our Supabase documentation here, and you'll see there's a step on changing the auth confirmation path. What it says here is go to the Auth templates dashboard page, take your confirm sign up and change this confirmation URL to this string here. Go ahead and copy this string here. And then what I'm going to do is we're going to go back to the Supabase dashboard. You're going to go to authentication. You're going to go to email templates. And then where it says confirm sign up, you're going to change this bit here where it has those curly brackets and confirmation URL. And you're going to paste in that string there. What this is doing is the confirmation email is now going to have a link to auth/confirm, and we're going to go ahead and have to set up that route in our Next.js application. So essentially when it gets back a code, it gets that and then it exchanges that for a session token. So that's how we can authenticate the user's email. So let's go back to our code now. As I said, the next step we need is an app/auth/confirm folder. Now in this app/auth/confirm folder, you're going to want to create a root.ts file, go back to the documentation here, and you'll see we have the code that we need for that. So we can go ahead and copy that. So what this is doing is, as I said, it takes in that code, so that token hash that we're going to get back from the confirm email, and it goes ahead and it verifies that email with that one-time password that's been sent back. And then you can also redirect them if there's an error with authenticating them. As I said, for me and the login, I don't want an error page. I'm just going to redirect them to the login. And then, as I say there, I'm going to add a message that says could not verify one-time password. So as I said, we're going to be using that search params later, and you'll see that in the page.tsx. Another thing we can do as well is sometimes with emails, you'll have that next link, so where they're going to go next. We're going to change this to /todos by default, or it will use the next search param instead. But as I said, for us, we're just going to be using /todos here. So when they do sign up with that one-time password and then they go back to the page, they're going to be redirected to /todos once they are confirmed in. So there we go. We have everything ready for the email sign-up form. So now we actually need to go ahead and link the form itself. So in login and page.tsx, what we do is you'll see we have our two inputs here and we have a form. Since we have a form, we can use our form actions on our buttons down here. The first one we have is we're going to have the login button. To change this, all we're going to have to do is form action. So on a button now, you have an available prop called form action. What essentially this is saying is it's going to treat the button essentially like a submit button, but it's going to change what we do with that form data based on this form action prop instead. So that means we can have a login and sign up button that do different things based on whether they're clicked with the same form data. Here we're going to add email login for that login page. And then for sign up button down here, I have this button, which is just a clickable one, that's sign up. For this, we're going to add form action. And that for me is just going to be the sign up function that we created from actions. So there you go. You should have the form action with email login, form action with sign up there. And that should allow us now to actually use this correctly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a test email. And then I'm going to add a password. And I'm going to hit login first, and this should fail. And you'll see we get that message back in the search params up here, couldn't authenticate user. So instead, I'm going to click sign up. Now, once I've clicked sign up, you'll see that it's redirected us to the login page here. But essentially what's happened is an email has been sent to that email address just to make sure we can verify our email. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and load up my emails and make sure we've got that one. So I have received that email now, and essentially what I'm going to do, I'm going to paste in that confirm email link, and you'll see we have that @type sign up, we have a code, and what you'll notice is it goes to that localhost 3000 page with auth/confirm there. I'm going to go ahead and click enter on that, and what you'll see is we get redirected to the to-dos page as we have been logged in. However, how do we know the user themselves is logged in? Obviously, we could call and get that to-dos, but what I do want to change in this step is just change the header to have the username of the user and change the sign in button to a sign out button. To do that first, though, we do need that server action for sign out. So I'm going to go ahead in here, and underneath email login and email sign up, what we're going to do is we're going to do export async function, and we're just going to call this sign out like so. The first line is going to have to be Supabase, so we're going to use the same that we used everything else, where you're doing that const Supabase create client. The next line is going to be await supabase.auth.signout like so. And then what we can do is we can redirect them to wherever you want. If someone signs out, I'm going to want to redirect them to the /login page. So that should be everything that you need for the sign out function. But now what we need to do is pull through the username and then attach whether they are signed in or signed out and change the button based on that. To do that, let's go into our header. I'm just going to collapse everything to make this a bit clearer. Let's click header.tsx, and you'll see that we have a server component here with the header. Since this is a server component, what you want to do is firstly make sure it's async, as we're now going to be using some awaits in here. But as I said, since it's a server component, we can actually use some of our database functions from within this. So the first line there is going to be const supabase equals await create client, like so. Create client again being imported from the file we made from utils supabase/server. The next line in here is we're going to then try and get the user. For this, we're going to do const, and then we're going to use object destructuring, and it's actually going to be data, and then we're going to destructure that object again to get the user from it. And then all of this is going to be equal to await supabase.auth.get user. This one here, like so. So now user should either be a user or null. So what we can do with this is we can go down here, and underneath our button step here, we can say if user isn't null. So that's going to be the first step. And then we can make a ternary out of this. So if the user isn't null, the first thing that we're going to want to do is return a p tag with that username in it. So I'm just going to wrap this all in a div quickly, like so. And then the first bit, as I said, is I'm going to add that paragraph tag here. And inside this paragraph tag, I'm going to use user.email, like so. And then also at the end of this ternary, just going to delete this curly bracket as I want to return this sign up or sign in button if there isn't a user. So as I said, it's doing if the user isn't null, show their email address. Otherwise, show the sign in. But now we also need that sign up or sign out button. To do that, I'm just going to come under here and do button. And then on button, what I'm going to do is just change this to a sign out button, like so. So you'll see we have that sign out button. Just going to add some styling up here as well to the class name. So let's make that flex. Item center, like so. And then maybe let's give it a gap of 4 or 2. Let's give it a gap of 2 like that, just to make sure there's a bit of spacing there. Now with the button, obviously as this is a server component and we need the button to be essentially, we could need it to be a client component if we wanted to call that sign out function. What you could do is move the button to a separate file. But another thing and another pattern that I've seen in Next.js is we can actually still keep this all within the server by essentially adding a form that is just a button. So to do this, what we can do is we can actually change our div up here. If I change this to a form, and then obviously change the closing tag to a form, we can add an action to this form that's just going to be run whenever we click that button. So we do action here. What we can do is we can say sign out is obviously the function we imported from our component up here, so from login/actions. So what's going to happen now is if I hit that button, it's going to go ahead and essentially send off for this form completion. So it's going to go ahead and run the sign out function for us. So if we click sign out now, what you should see is it signs us out and we go back to that login page. And now another thing to note though is if we click on to-dos here, what you'll see is we can still get to the to-do root. And at the moment the to-dos is just a static array list, so this shouldn't be related to the user. But what we do want to do is actually protect some of our pages now. So we can go ahead and protect our pages based on whether a user is logged in or logged out. To do that, let's go to our to-dos page and then go to page.tsx. As I said again, this is a server component, which means we can use our Supabase call within here. So to do that, we're going to do const Supabase, and that's just going to equal await create client. We're going to import create client from, again, our Supabase server file. Now in here, what we can do is we can do the same thing to go ahead and get the user. So as I said there, it's that const data, and then we destructure the user. And what we can do here is add one line that's quite important, and this line here is just going to be, if there isn't a user, simply return a redirect to /login, like so. And then redirect is going to be imported from next/navigation. And there we go. Now if we click on our to-dos page, you'll see we're not able to get there since we're logged in. The other thing I do like to do is if we go back to the login page, scroll up to the top, we can actually add essentially the same code here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste these lines here. And if we go into page.tsx, we're going to copy it, but we're going to make one change. So in our login page here, instead, we obviously want the non-authenticated user to be able to go to our login page. So what I like to say is, if there is a user, go to to-dos. Essentially just stopping an authenticated user from getting to the login page, as that's probably not what they want, as they're already logged in. Make sure we import everything correctly there. And again, make sure this function up here is async. So essentially, as I said, what I've done is I've made sure if they are logged in. So let's go ahead and log in this user and check everything is working. Now that they're logged in, if I tried to go to the /login page, so let's go /login, it would just redirect them to the to-dos page. And again, if I sign out now and try to go to the to-dos page, they can't get there because they're not authenticated. And we've essentially protected that route there. And that's using all of that middleware stuff that we implemented earlier. So now I'm going to go ahead and commit all of this as step 2, email login. So let's just call this, as I said, step 2, email, sign up, and login. Like so. Now that we've got that, we can move on to how we can actually log in with an OAuth provider now. And as I said, I'm going to be using GitHub in my example, but that documentation should help you through everything. And the setup that I'm actually using, you can use any provider with. The only step that's different is the step where we actually go to GitHub and set up our OAuth application. So to get started with that, let's go back to our Supabase dashboard. In our Supabase dashboard, you're going to want to go to configurations and providers. As you'll see here, you'll see an absolute limit of the amount of providers you'll have. So you can use Facebook, Figma, GitHub. You can use so many different providers here. But as I said, the one we're going to be using is GitHub. I'm going to tick this click for GitHub enabled, and you'll see it has a callback URL for us. We're going to go ahead and copy this callback URL. Next, you're going to want to go to GitHub/settings/developers when you're logged in, and you should see a page like this, and then you're going to want to click OAuth apps here. Register a new application. We're going to give this a name. That's just going to be Superdudo. Give it a homepage URL. For us, we're going to use localhost, as I'm not actually hosting this anywhere, but you want to change this to essentially your domain name. And then the authorization callback URL is the URL that we just copy and pasted from Supabase there. Register the application. Once you've registered that, go ahead and copy over this client ID back to Supabase. Copy that back to Supabase here. And then what we also need is a client secret here. So you're going to want to click Generate a New Client Secret. Once you've generated a new client secret, as you'll see here, you'll get one that you can copy and paste over. Again, these are all secret values that shouldn't be shared with anyone, but since I know I'm going to delete all of these after this tutorial, I'm okay showing them on screen. We're going to go ahead and click Save here, and what you should see eventually is it will check that, and it will say enabled there for GitHub. Next thing we're going to want to do is go to their documentation. As I said, their documentation is so good, and then we can copy and paste some of their code samples from here as well. So what we have with an OAuth provider is essentially it's going to go off to GitHub, check that the user has a valid GitHub account, and then it's going to go ahead and return us to this auth callback root.ts. So it's going to return them to your domain name, auth/callback, with a code attached to it. So we can go ahead and essentially turn that GitHub validated code into a session on our side. So to do that, we're going to go into auth. Now, not in the confirm folder, but outside of the confirm folder, we're going to create a new folder called callback, like so. And again, just make sure that's outside of that auth folder like that. So you should have two separate like this. And then inside of this, we're going to create a root.ts. Going to go ahead and copy and paste this code from their site here. As I said, it's just taking in a code from that search params that GitHub is going to return. And then it's going to essentially go ahead and set the cookie for us based on validating them there. What we do have here as well is you can return the user to an error page here. So as it says here, if there is an authentication error, you can go ahead and redirect them and say there was an error. Again, for us, we're just going to change this to login and then say, let's say message, let's say could not log in with provider, like that. So again, we're changing that. You may want to actually leave in an error page that has some more details on how they could possibly get through these errors. And now that we have that redirect URL up here as well, very similar to how we did it in the auth confirm route, we're going to want to change this to /todos. This is so that when they do log in with GitHub, it's going to redirect them to this page instead. So it's just a nice user flow. So when they log in, they just get straight to their dashboard, essentially. Now that we've got that, we need to add our buttons for the actual OAuth providers. As I said, that step is pretty much the only bit that will change was that GitHub step that we did. Everything else should be the same from here on out, unless there's something very specific to the OAuth provider, but I believe most of them should follow this setup here. So the next step, as I said, we need to add our OAuth providers. So we need to add a button underneath here that says login with GitHub. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a component in my login folder here. I'm going to create a component called OAuth-signin.tsx. And then in here, what I'm going to do is create some TypeScript types. So the first TypeScript type we're going to create is we're going to do type. And this is going to be essentially a helper type so that if we do add multiple providers, we can use it from this. So this is going to be called OAuth provider. And that's going to be equal to an object. Now, first, we're going to have a name. And the name is actually going to use the type provider from @Supabase/Supabase.js. Now, this is essentially just checking that the string is one of Supabase's valid providers. And you can also probably see the string that you'll have to use here, as it might be slightly different. As you'll notice here, for LinkedIn, it's LinkedIn_OIDC. But for us, it's just going to be GitHub. Next thing we're going to want to do is just add a display name. So display name is just how we're going to show it in the button. So we may not want to show GitHub lowercase. So we want to add a display name. And the next bit we're going to add as well is a optional icon. And this is going to be a JSX.element. So if we do want to show an icon in our button, we have the option to do that. This allows us to use an array in our function, essentially, so that we can have a load of different buttons and we only have to set it up in one place. So let's do this now. So we're going to do export function, and then we're going to call this OAuth. I'm going to call this buttons. And then in OAuth buttons, what we can do in here is we can say const OAuth providers. So we're going to set up an array of providers, and that's going to be of type OAuth provider, and then an array of that type. That's going to equal to a new array. And then in that new array, we're going to set up our first one, as I said, which for us is GitHub. And then we're going to have that friendly name or display name here be GitHub. And then for icon here, I'm going to actually use a GitHub icon, which I can get from Lucid React. And then I'm just going to add some class names onto that quickly just to make sure that it looks good. So we're going to add width, let's say size of 5, like so. So now, as I said, you could add in as many providers into this array as you want. And now we can just map over that providers to add all of our login buttons for us. So now we can simply do a return of fragment. And then inside of this, we can do OAuth providers dot map. And then as it's even correcting for me there, we can then do provider. And then we can say equals. And then inside of here, we're just going to return a button. For me, I'm going to be using a shadcn button. What we're going to do is we're going to do login with, and then we'll do provider.name or display name that we used earlier. I'm going to go ahead and make sure I've imported this button correctly there. I'm then also going to give this some styling. So I'm going to use the variant of ghost or outline, like so. Make sure I just make this easier so it's on one line. So yeah, there we go. We have a variant of outline. Make sure I spell this correctly. And then also on this, we're going to add the class names just to make sure that the actual icons look good. So that's going to be item center, justify center, and then a gap of 2. I'll go ahead and save all of that. Now we see there is an error here at the moment as our JSX fragment isn't properly returned. Make sure we do that with the curly brackets. So essentially you should have something looking like this. As I said, this is just going to be mapping over our buttons. Let's go ahead and add this component to our page.tsx, and then we'll actually link up the logic behind it. So underneath, for me, underneath form, what I'm going to do is going to add OAuth buttons like so. And I'm going to save that. And you'll see now we have a button that says login with GitHub. Let's go up and fix some of that styling up here. So we can say width is full, like that. And then in page.tsx as well, I just need to change the styling. So this form up here, or this card content here, if I give this a class name of flex-col, and then gap-4, as it's even suggested for me there. And then I can change this margin top 4 down here as well to get rid of some of that. And there we go, we have our login with GitHub. And as I said, if you have a load of different buttons or login with Google and various other things, you can change that there as well. Inside of here as well, I also want to use that provider.icon. There we go, we have a nice icon and it says login with GitHub. Obviously you can change the text however you want, but now we do actually need to link this up to how we actually sign the user in with this OAuth. To do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go into our same actions.ts route, and we're actually going to create a new function in here now for the OAuth sign-in. So we're going to do export async function. That's going to be OAuth sign in, and then we're going to take in a provider. And that provider is simply going to be, again, from that Supabase type that we imported in the other component, just to make sure it's type safe there. And then what we can also do is just say if there isn't a provider, we can return an error. So we can just, let's say, return redirect. Again, we can log into that /login, and then we can attach to that search param again. So if there is no provider, we first want to error out. Obviously, you may not need this check, as we should know there's a provider, as this is type safe, but I'm just showing you the example there. So once we've checked that there is a provider, what we can do is we can first set up our Supabase client, like so. So the same way we have in all of our other functions. We then also want to set up a redirect URL. What the redirect URL here is essentially what we pass to GitHub and whichever other provider we're using to say this is where we want the user to come back to. So for this, I'm actually using a get URL function that I have created in my utils/helper file. So essentially what this does is it just checks a load of environment variables to check for the site URL. So it's going to be the next public site URL, which essentially you can set to say this is the domain name where everyone should be going back to. Worst case, if that fails to get that, aka you haven't set that, it's going to use the Vercel URL. So if you're hosting with Vercel, you're going to use that. And then again, if that isn't set, it's going to go back to localhost 3000. So if you are hosting somewhere else other than Vercel, you may want to change this. Essentially just add a environment variable in your .env.local to next public site URL, and then change that to localhost 3000. And then when you're live, change it to your domain name that you're going to be using to host it. As I said, this is essentially just a fancy way to get what the base domain name is. And if you're using my example repo, it's already there for you. Now, inside of this, what we do need to do is send them to /auth/callback. So we're telling GitHub to go ahead and link them to whatever the base domain name here is, /auth/callback, as that was the route that we set up earlier. Now, once we have all of that and that redirect URL, what we can then do is we can say const, and then we can do error, like so. And then we can equal this, and then we're going to use a Supabase function. So we're going to do Supabase, then we're going to do .auth, and then we're going to do sign in with OAuth, like so. And then in OAuth, we're going to pass this an object inside of this function. We're going to add provider, and that is just going to be the provider itself, so we can shorthand that. And then we're going to add options here. Now, this options bit is where we want to add that redirect to, and that redirect to is going to be redirect URL, like so. Now, again, similar to how we've done it with everything else, we need to check if error, and if there is an error, let's go ahead and then reply with that login and then /message. And then, however, if there isn't an error, what we can now do is we can say redirect. And now what we actually need here is, instead of error up here, we need data and error. And the reason for that is essentially once Supabase goes off and checks we're using the GitHub provider, what we need to do is then get the URL that the data returns, as this is actually the URL that's then going to redirect the user to GitHub to sign in there, and then that's going to come back to our application to sign them in with GitHub in our application. So data.url, as I said, is what's going to send them off to Google or whatever you're using as your provider. So there we go. We actually have the action set up. Now we can go back to our page.tsx, go into our OAuth sign-in. We now need to change this to a use client, as we're going to have the buttons have an on-click in here. We could use the form hack as well that I showed you before, but let's use an on-click in here. Now what we can do is we can do an on-click on our button. And then on our button, what we're going to do is we're actually going to make this function async, like so. And then with that async function, we're just simply going to have it do await OAuth sign-in, which is coming from that function that we just set up in the other file. And then we're going to pass through the provider.name, like so. There we go. So now everything should be set up to allow us to sign in with GitHub or whichever other provider that you've utilized. So let's go ahead and test it on the right here. So if I hit login with GitHub here, what you should see is it should send off to GitHub and it's just say I need to authorize, since this is the first time, just to allow this application to use my personal user data. So I'm going to go ahead and click authorize. Now let's authorize. As I said, it's even sent back to our page here through GitHub as we passed it that redirect URL. And now we've gone to the to-dos page and it's loaded in our GitHub username here. Now there is a bit of a styling issue here on mobile, which we could fix later. But since it's a tutorial, I'm not going to bother with that at the moment. But as you'll see, we can hit sign out as well, and that all works nicely. And if we hit login with GitHub again, what you'll notice is we don't even call off to the GitHub page, or at least it doesn't seem like we do. As it's already been authenticated behind the scenes, we can essentially now sign in nice and easy there using the GitHub provider as well. So that's how you can set up any number of OAuth providers. All you have to do now is set them up on the Supabase dashboard, go into your OAuth sign-in, and then just add the provider to this array here. So you can set up any number. Let's go ahead now and commit all of this as step 3, add OAuth. So I've committed all of that. Now, the next thing that we need to do is tackle how we now essentially handle the CRUD side of our application, which is create, read, update, and delete. So we've set up all of the user authentication stuff. So all we need to do now is, now we have all of that user authentication stuff, is add some to-dos to the database and then be able to read them, delete them, and do various other things to them. So let's get started with that, and we're going to start off with reading. So if we go into our pages here, what you'll see is we can close down that login page. I'm just going to collapse everything again to keep this nice and clean. We go into app now, to-dos, and page.tsx. What you'll notice is this is where we have that this is a to-do. At the moment, it's just an array, a string array. We actually want to change that to be something different. To do that, firstly, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to load in all of the to-dos from the database instead of being this URL here. So to do that, as I said, we're in this page here. What we can do is, now that we check to user is authenticated, we even have our Supabase client set up from earlier. We can change to-dos to now equal await. And what we'll do is we'll do Supabase, and then we'll do .from. And then from, you're going to want to use your table name. For us, that was to-dos. Then we're going to do select. As I said, we can select all now because we're using that row level security. So it's only going to select anything related to that user anyway. So we don't even have to check on their user ID. But one thing I do want to do is I want to order everything. I'm going to order it by the date it was created at, so that's going to be inserted at. And then I'm going to change this to be ascending false as well. So it's going to be ascending false. So that's going to order it by a specific way, which is just that inserted at date. Now what you see is it says todos.map is not a function. What we do actually need to do is change this, because every Supabase function essentially just returns some data. But now on that data, we're just going to rename that to todos instead. So we're using object destructuring there to get from our Supabase function the to-dos, which comes back as data, but we're just going to rename that to to-dos. Now, at the moment, we're not getting any errors when we actually should be, as to-dos down here is expecting a string array, whereas this shouldn't be a string array. As you'll notice, this isn't any array. What we do actually need to do now is change where we set up our Supabase server. If you remember earlier, we did put in that Supabase.ts type. we go down now to server.ts. We can actually change this. So where it says create client, if you change this and then add some brackets here, or let's type it, what we can do is we can do type with database and then make sure we import that from @types/Supabase that we created earlier. What this is doing is essentially telling that create client what the database structure is using our types there. So now when we go back to to-dos, what you'll notice is it shows us everything we have on that, and it's nicely set up for TypeScript. And now we're getting some errors as we are using to-dos separately elsewhere. Another thing I like to do is go into types, and what we'll do is we'll do new file, we'll do custom.ts. Inside of this custom.ts, what I'm going to do is I'm going to export a type, and I'm just going to call this to-do. As I said, since we have that database, we can load in our to-dos, but doing this everywhere is quite cumbersome. So if we do /public like that, and then on public, what we're going to do is we're going to get the tables. So it's going to look like that. Then on here, we're going to get to-dos, and then on here, we're going to get a row, as that's the bit that we're worried about. So what you'll see here is there's various different types. Insert is just all of the data that you need to insert. So you don't actually need an ID, you don't need inserted at, and you don't need is complete technically. All you need is that user ID. For row, it's just going to make sure everything's returned from the database. The reason, as I said, that I'm doing this is if we go back to that type there, is this is going to be quite long to write everywhere. So it's just nice to add in sort of custom ones so you can export that type to-do, and then we can just write to-do everywhere we want that type. Let's go into our to-dos list now, and then let's change that array of string to be an array of to-do, like so. And then again, with to-do item, we can come in here and change it from, instead of just being a single string, to be a to-do. And then we can change it down here as well. This is going to start erroring out as it doesn't know what to-do technically is. We need to do to-do.task. And again, change this one here. Just changing it from string that we set up earlier. And now we can have to-do.task there for our card. Let's go back to to-dos.list, and you'll notice the key is also erroring out. Let's make this to-do.id as well. So now we're set up to literally pull through any of our to-dos that we've added from our database. But obviously, there's a problem. We need to actually add some. So to do that, we need to link up the form for creating them. So to do this, let's go into our to-do form here. And you'll notice we have two components here. Now, I've actually separated out the form content from the form, and you'll see why later. This is about using form status. But for now, essentially follow this structure. So to actually link up our form so that when we hit this submit button here, we get some creation, what we need to do is create some more actions similar to how we did for the login. So we're going to create a new file within this actions page, and we're going to call this actions.ts. Now this actions.ts, as I said, is going to be everywhere that we're going to handle our server actions. So we're going to do use server at the top, and this is going to be everywhere we handle our server actions related to the to-dos themselves. So the first one is going to be export async function, add to-do. And then in here, we're going to do form data, and then form data, which is a type we can import like so. And then on that, what we're going to do is we're going to do Supabase equals create client like we have elsewhere, and just make sure we import that create client from that Supabase util file. And then in here, what we're going to do is we'll do text. So firstly, we're going to get the text from the form data. As I said, the way we do that is we use form data.get. Now for me, I called the text area input to-do, like so. And then again, what we can do is we can actually typecast that to string or null. As I said earlier, if you'll probably want to add a more experienced form validation library onto this, but for now we can do string or null. And then I can simply do a quick check that just says if text is null. Obviously what we can do is we can then throw a new error. So I'll throw a new error, which just says text is required. Like so. And then you'd actually handle this from an error page as well using error.tsx and NextJS. But for this example, we're just going to skip over that bit for now. The next step is we want to make sure the user is authenticated so we can actually get that ID to insert. So what we do is do data and then user like so. And that's just going to equal await supabase.auth.getUser like that. So underneath that, what we can now do is we can say if there is no user, throw a new error saying the user is not logged in, like that. And then finally, what we can do is we can say const, and then as we don't need the data returned from the actual sign-in or for the add function, we're just going to get if there's an error on it instead. And now what we can do is finally add the entry to our database. So we can do await supabase.from, and then we'll do to-dos like so, and then .insert, and then we'll insert a new to-do object. So inside of here, all we actually need to insert something is the task itself, which is just going to come from text. And then all we need is the user ID as well, which is just going to come from user.id, like that. And there we go, that will actually insert it into our function. Now again, what we can do is check that there wasn't an error inserting that into our database. If there is, we can just throw another new error. And that can say error adding task. And then once all of that's done, the last thing we need to do is actually revalidate our paths. So with revalidate path, we need to revalidate essentially anywhere that the data from inserting this should be updated. So for us, that's that /todos page. So when we go ahead and add something, it's going to revalidate the cache to make sure that the essentially to-do list isn't cached, and it's going to revalidate it to add our new entry, and you should see that update nicely. So now that that's done, what we need to do is link up our form so when we actually submit it, it calls this server action. To do that, what we're going to do is go back to our to-do form here. At the top of this now, what I'm actually going to do is change this to a client component. And the reason for that is we want the form to clear its values once it's been submitted. And to do that, we need to use a form ref. So come down here, and firstly, we'll do that bit. We'll do const form ref equals useRef from React. And that's going to be HTML form element ref, like so. And we'll make that null by default. But then on the form here, we'll just pass through a ref. And that's going to equal that form ref there that we just set up, like so. Now what we need to do is set up the actual action for when we submit this form. So when we hit this button here, what happens when we submit it? For that, what we're going to do is we're going to use on the form, it has that action prop. Inside of this action prop, we're going to make it an async function, which is going to take data. And then inside of this function here, what we're going to do is we're going to obviously go ahead and do await, add to do, which we just created from our server actions file. Pass it through all of the form data as that's what it's expecting. Then underneath this, what we can now do is do formRef.current, and then if that exists, we can do .reset. As I said, what this is doing is once the to-do is added, it's going to go ahead and clear the form for us. So now what we should see is if we add a first to-do, let's call this hello world, like now. Submit that, what you should see is it goes off, it runs that server action that we set up, it inserts it into the database, and it revalidates the path for us. So there we go, we've handled the creating and reading of to-dos. It's a really good time to go ahead and finish this to-do as well, which is subscribe. So go ahead and tick that off and hit subscribe down below. Now what we need to do is handle the updating and deletion. So I'm going to go ahead and save all of this, however, as this is going to be step 4, create and read. And now we can go ahead and link up how we actually make sure that this ticking off the checkbox is handling that on the server side, so changing it in the database, and making sure we can actually delete some of these as well. So for delete and update, what we actually need to do is go back to our actions and add in some server actions for those functionalities as well. So in here, what we do is we do export async function, and this one here is going to be delete to do. On this, I'm actually going to take in an ID, which is going to be a number, as that's the ID that we use for our to-dos. Again, we can do that check for if there isn't an ID, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to do const Supabase create client. And then in here, what I'm going to do is do const, and then we're going to do data. And again, we're checking on that user again. So we can do that await supabase.getUser like that. Now, once we have all of that, we can again check if there isn't a user. So if there is no user, throw a new error that the user isn't logged in. And now we can finally go ahead and try the delete. And we'll do the same thing we've done before, where we don't need the data object. We just need whether there's been an error with actually doing our function. And now we can do Supabase.from and then to-dos, like it's suggesting there. And then on all of this, we can do .delete. And .delete doesn't actually take anything in. So if we do .delete like this, what we need to do is then do a .match. And then this .match is essentially how we tell it what we're matching against to delete. For that, we're going to be matching against the user ID, so user_ID, and that's just going to be equal to user.id. And then underneath this as well, we're going to be matching on ID that we pass through, and that's going to be ID, like so. So as I said, what this is doing is we take in the ID of the to-do we want to delete from the database, and then it goes off and makes sure that we're deleting the one which is related to the user with that ID there. So now we can obviously do our if error, so same as we've done loads of before. We can say throw new error, error deleting task. And then finally, we do the same thing we did with add, which is we revalidate the path which we're concerned with. And for us, that's /todos. Now, we need to do something very similar for update to do. So let's go ahead and create that one now, since we're in this file. We can do export async function. And then we'll call this update to-do. Now, you could obviously change these functions to be essentially a bit more minimal. So let's say at the moment I'm just doing update to-do, which is just going to take in a to-do itself. You could just take in, for example, the text or the checked, and you can make these functions a bit more minimal. But for this, we're just going to do it this way. We're going to do const Supabase equals create client, and then again, we're going to get user to make sure we're checking against that user as before. Go ahead and do, if there isn't a user, throw new error. And then finally, we can do our Supabase functionality again. So what we can do is we can say const, and then we can do that error bit, error, like so. That's going to equal to await Supabase. And then on this, we're going to do Supabase.from, similar to the ones before, .todos, .update, and then we can actually just give it the whole to-do object here. And then we also need to do .match. Now, you'd think we could give it the whole to-do here, but I've actually had problems doing that. So if we just match this on user_ID is user.id, and again, the ID is todo.id. And then finally, we can do the same thing we've done again, which is if there's an error, throw a new error and just say error updating task. And then finally, revalidate path /todos. There we go. Make sure we've imported our type that we created from @types/custom. And you'll see we have our two functions. We have that delete one. So this is the bit that's actually handling the delete. It's saying from our to-dos database or from our to-dos table, go ahead and delete anything that matches this. And then the same for update. It's going to go ahead and update with the values to update. So as I said, we're passing through a whole to-do. So we'll just change something on the original object. It's just going to go ahead and update that based on whichever what this is. Again, similar to delete. And both times they're revalidating the path /todos. So let's go ahead and hook this up. So the first one we're going to hook up is the delete, as obviously we can now check that really easily. So to do that, we're going to go to to-do item, and you'll see we have a button for the delete here. Now we just need to add in our actual server component for that, or server action. For that, again, what we're going to do, since this is now nested in a form, we can use on the button, we can use a form action. So now we can do form action. Inside of this form action, what we can now do is we're going to do async brackets data. So let's do async brackets data like so. That's going to equal to a new function. And this function here is just going to be await delete to-do, which we just created. And then from there, we're going to do todo.id, which we can get from the props. So there we go. Our to-do of delete should actually start working. But what we do need to do is add useClient at the top here. So let's do useClient at the top there. And now that that's refreshed, what we should see is if we hit delete on something, it goes ahead, it goes off to the database, and that works. Really nice. Now we have our deletion step working. So you see there we can delete something. So that's now deleting from the database correctly. Next bit we need to do is handle the updating. So obviously if we click the checkbox, how it goes off and then sends that to the server. So for that, what I'm going to do is I have my checkbox here, which is actually using Shadcn's checkbox. I'm going to change the checked value on this to be a Boolean. I'm just going to wrap this in a Boolean of todo.isComplete. This is essentially just making sure that if it's null, obviously it converts it to a Boolean as well. So now that we've got that, what I can do is add an on-check change. So that's how I handle it for this checkbox. Yours might be slightly different. But what I'll do is on-check change, what I can do is I can say async and then val. So that's going to be the value of the checkbox. And then we're going to do a function in here. And what I'll do is, firstly, for checkboxes with Radix UI or Shadcn, we need to check that it's not intermediate. So I'm going to check that the value isn't intermediate. So if it is intermediate, we'll just return null. So let's just change that there. And now what we can do is we can say await update todo, like so. And then we'll pass that the todo object. So it's just going to be todo, but then we'll change is_complete to the value, like that. And there we go. That will now change it on the database side of things. So if I go ahead and tick subscribe, like you should, and then refresh the page, what you'll see is it's pulling in that checkbox value from the database. And if we went to our table, we would see that isComplete is ticked. So there we go. We've actually handled the update and delete step in there now. Now, there is one thing that you may notice is when we click that checkbox, there's a bit of a delay that can feel slow to the user. So if I go ahead and let's say I add in a delay onto our actions. So if I go to update todo, now you don't need to do this bit. I'm going to add a fake 3-second delay. And you'll see when I click that now, there's a 3-second delay between it actually showing the user. So the next bit that I'm going to handle is how we can add some extra stuff using some new React hooks. So that's going to be useFormStatus and useOptimistic to essentially show the user whether something's pending. so something's happening on the server side, or with useOptimistic, how we can make it an optimistic update so it instantly changes on that screen, but it might take a while on the server, but as we said, we're optimistically updating it. Let's move on to that now. So I'm going to go ahead and commit all of this as step 5, update and delete. Okay, so the first method that we're going to be using is using the useFormStatus hook. So for that, what we can do is we can go to, firstly, our to-do form. So when we submit this form, let's make sure that the fields disable for when it's actually adding and sending off, so that they don't add another one or click or spam the send button, for example. So to do that, this is why I have actually separated out form content, because to use this hook of useFormStatus, it has to be within a form context, and to do that, it obviously has to be a child component of form, so we couldn't set it up here as that's in the same component. So now what we do is we come onto form content here, we can say const, and then we can do an object destructure here and just say pending. And pending is going to equal to useFormStatus, which comes from React DOM. So that comes from React itself. Now, all we have using that is we can now say disabled on the text area equals pending, and on the button as well, we can add disabled, and that's going to equal to pending as well. And that's actually our first usage of that useFormStatus hook. So now we went ahead and said hello world like this. What you'll see quickly is it grays out there while it's waiting for the server to complete and confirm that that action actually occurred. That way they can't spam that button. So we said spam button here, and I tried to spam this. You'll see that it gets disabled there, and then finally once the server's complete, it resets the form and we're ready to add a new one. We can actually go ahead and add that to the to-do item to show the same thing for a deletion event as well. So if we now go to to-do item, you'll see this is actually why I separated it out like this. You may have looked at this earlier and thought that was a bit weird that I wasn't wrapping this component, but this is why we handled it there. So now what we can do is we can do the same thing here. We can say const and then pending, and that's going to equal to useFormStatus here, like so. And now we can go ahead and use that. So what I'm going to use that for is, firstly, I'm going to change the opacity to some of the entire card based on whether it's pending status. So what I can do is say pending and then opacity 50 if that is pending. And I can also go ahead and disable the checkbox, for example, if it is pending, and then disable the button as well if it's pending, like so. Now that I've done that, well, you'll see if I delete something, it grays out for a bit there until it's confirmed deleted. There we go. So there we go, that's all nicely hooked up. But what you'll notice is the checkbox doesn't actually work there. I'm going to show an alternative method at the end of the video that would get the checkbox to work for this. But what I actually want to show you now is the useOptimistic hook, which I think is a way better usage of this checkbox. And that way we can see when we delete something or add something, it immediately updates the UI for the user. And then we can actually go ahead behind the scenes. And if there was an error adding it, we could then come back to the user and say error adding this and then remove it. Most of the time there won't be an error, which is why optimistic UIs are great, as it just makes a application look really snappy. So let's move on to that. I'm going to go ahead and commit this as a very small step, step 6, useFormStatus. So this next hook, as I said, is useOptimistic, is another new one in React. So it's going to be in React 19, but we can use it already using Next.js as they use Next Canary builds. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our to-do list. Now, at the moment, this is quite simple as it takes in that to-dos that we get from the server from our page.tsx. What we're going to want to do in here is we're going to want to change this to use client, and then we're going to use optimistic as we can start using that hook. So up here, let's change this to use client. Now that we have use client here, what we want to do is set up a reducer first. So the first thing we can do is we're going to do export type action. And this is going to be a type that's just going to define the actions that we want to perform on our optimistic list. So for me, that's going to be delete, update, and then create as well, like so. Now we're going to use that in a function that we're essentially going to call a reducer. So that's what the optimistic hook takes in. So to do that, and this will be a bit clearer once we start writing this function, what we do is we do export function, and I'm going to call this to-do reducer, like so. This to-do reducer is going to take in state, and that state is just going to be an array of to-do, like so. Let's make sure we type correctly, using that to-do type that we imported or created from our custom types earlier. And then the actual next prop is going to be an object, and that object is going to have an action on it and a to-do. And then we're going to type that as well as, obviously, action is going to be from our action type that we just created. And then our to-do, again, is going to be a to-do, like so. Now that we have that function, what do we do inside of there? So now we need to perform, essentially, change the state input based on whatever the action is. So as you'll see there, it's pretty much recommending what we need to do. But what we're going to do is we're going to do switch on the action. So based on the action, perform something else. So in the case of a delete, let's do return, and we'll just do state.filter. And then inside of the filter, we'll just filter based on ID from that to-do. And then we'll say, essentially, if ID isn't equal to to-do.id, and there we go, that will go ahead and delete that ID for us based on that. Make sure I wrap this correctly in brackets here. So we go ahead and wrap that in brackets. That should clear that error there as we're using object destructuring. So as I said, our first one is we take in the state. So this is essentially, think of this as your to-do list. This is essentially the master list. And if the action that we passed in is delete and the to-do we've passed in, we essentially return the state list just filtered to exclude that deleted ID. So the next one we need to do is we need to do it in the case of an update. So in the case of an update, what we can do is we can do return state.map. So we're going to map over all of our states. And then we're just going to do essentially a t like so. So that's going to represent our to-do. We're going to say if t.id equals to-do.id. So if the map value we're mapping over is the one that we actually want to change, let's change it to whatever we've passed through as the data to update. Otherwise, let's just leave it untouched, like so. So it's a really simple one line to essentially say, if the to-do ID is passed through with this, just change it to whatever we've passed through. Otherwise, return what was originally there. So that's how we handle the update. Now, the final one we need to do is create, and this one is really easy as well. So all of these are pretty simple here. Now, all we need to do with this is essentially return the array, but with our new to-do at the top of it. Now, you might want to change where the to-do is based on how you're filtering this. As I said, since I'm filtering by new should be appear first, I'm going to have the to-do at the start of the array. You may want to start it at the bottom of the array, but there we go. So for create, essentially all we do is just add our new to-do to the array. And then finally, we can add a default case as well. And in the default case, I'm just going to return the entire array again. Just going to return state like so. So there we go. We have our to-do reducer and we have that action. So how do we set that up? Well, one of the first things I want to do is, since we're passing this to useOptimistic, you'll see we're going to pass it down to some various props. I'm going to go ahead and create a type for this. So we're going to do export type, and then that's going to be to-do optimistic update, like so. That's going to equal to a function. So that function is going to be an action, and that action here is going to have action. So that's going to be from the type we created earlier. And then on that, we're also going to have a to-do, and that to-do is going to be a to-do, like so. And then all of this is just going to be a function that returns void. Essentially, what you'll see is we use this type later just to make sure that we don't have to have really complex types like this copy and pasted into all of our functions. We can now simply just use this one type here. Now let's get on to actually using the useOptimistic hook, as that's what we're here for. So what we do is, firstly, we do const, and then what we're going to say is optimistic like this, to-dos. And then we're also going to do the second side of the array is the updater function. So that's going to be optimistic to-dos update. So optimistic, make sure I spell everything correctly, update, like so. And all of this finally is going to equal useOptimistic, like so. And then in that useOptimistic, we pass it our to-dos list that we get as a prop from the function. As I said, the actual real to-dos list is what's passed through to this component. But then also on the second half of this, we pass through the to-do reducer that we just created. This is what your component should look like now. So we have this optimistic to-dos, again, making sure I spell everything correctly here. It's getting quite long. You may want to rename this function. And then we have our optimistic to-dos update. So we change this to-dos down here to our optimistic to-dos. And there you go, you're seeing that nothing's actually changed there, but essentially now what this is using is, instead of the actual real list from our server, it's using the useOptimistic list, which is populated from our server list, but then we can also make changes to it that occur immediately, and then when this to-dos gets updated, it then resets the list to the actual server list itself. So how do we go ahead and start using this? The first one that we're going to want to do is using it in the to-do form. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say optimistic update, like so. I'm just going to set that equal to the optimistic to-dos update function. Now this is going to error out as we actually don't have this prop on our to-do form yet. So we go back to our to-do form. Let's now add a prop to this. So the prop is going to be optimistic update there. And as I said, the type of that is going to be that type that we created earlier, which is that to-do optimistic update type. So there we go. Now we can actually optimistically update our form when we submit that value. So what you'll see is we have the action here with the await to-do, like so. So what we need to do is we need to add to our create a new to-do item, and we're actually going to fake some of the data for this. So to do this, what we're going to do is if we come into our action, we can now say optimistic update. And then the optimistic update, as we said, is expecting an action. So we create an object inside of here. We put the action prop. The action here is going to be create since we're in our to-do form. And then it's also going to need a whole to-do. For that to-do, let's actually create an object before this, which is going to be const new to-do, like so. I'm going to map that to the to-do type so that we get nice type completion there, like so. And then make sure I import that from custom. And then on this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the ID is equal to -1. Now, as I said, since this is an optimistic update, this isn't actually on the server, and the server is going to go in later and refresh it once it's added and change it. So essentially what I'm doing here is I'm adding some fake data. Same thing with inserted at, I'm actually just going to change that to an empty string, and the same thing with user ID. As all of this is happening on the client side, I don't actually need to check that there's a user ID related, as I know it's just essentially that client. And as I said, later on, once the server verifies that to-do's been added, all of this is going to get refreshed, so this data will be populated correctly. But all I need to do then is say task, and that's going to equal to my data.get, and then we need to get my to-do task on that, which I believe was from the field to-do. And I'm going to typecast that to string. So that's coming from this task up here, which is the name to-do. So that's just loading in the value. So we have the ID, the inserted at, and is there anything else that I'm missing on this? Let's check our to-do type. So we've got the ID, inserted at, and then yeah, also is complete. Let's set that to false. So there we go. We have our new to-do. So let's now put that in the object here. And finally, what you'll see is, so now what we're doing is when we submit this submit form, it goes off and it calls the action. It creates essentially a fake to-do that just has our data. And this is only going to be used to update the UI instantly. And the second it's been added to the server, it's going to go ahead and change this value to have the correct user ID and the correct ID values. But since we don't know the ID when we optimistically update, we can just set this to -1. Setting this to -1 is quite helpful, as if you want to run checks later on, you'll see we'll add some checks into to-do item, such as if we click delete and the ID is -1, don't run it, as we know that's not going to exist yet. Next, what we do is we do that optimistic update function. We pass it the action we want. So this is going to go ahead and run our reducer function with create, and it's going to go ahead and add that new to-do. So what this means is if I go ahead and say hello world again up here, what you'll notice is that's going to go ahead and immediately update it. However, there is a problem here, which is optimistic update isn't a function. That's because I haven't saved my to-do list here, but let's go ahead and save my actual to-do list functionality there. And let's try that one again. So let's do hello world. And you'll notice this will immediately appear down below. So really snappy there. And if you remember when we set up useFormState, you notice this only disables when the actual state hasn't been deleted. So let's go to our actions just to show you that. So if I go to add to-do action, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add that 3-second delay that I showed you earlier. And then if I come in here and I say hello again, what you'll notice is it will be grayed out as it's disabled, but that hello was added long before the server confirmed that it was actually added. And that's what essentially an optimistic update is. So now that we've done that on the form, let's go ahead and add a deletion optimistic update as well. So to do that, let's go to our to-do item in here, or let's first go to our to-do list. And then on to-do item, we're going to have to pass it that optimistic to-do update again. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste what we've got down here. So on the to-do item, we then need to pass it a prop that says optimistic update. That's going to be optimistic to-do's update. Now inside of the to-do item, again, what we're going to have to do is change it to have that new prop of optimistic update. And again, that's going to equal to our type, which is to-do optimistic update. Let's just change this down here. We should then have optimistic update. And that's to-do optimistic update there. And make sure we import that correctly. There we go. Now, again, since we have this nested component, we need to go ahead and pass all of this through again, which is a little bit annoying, but we could probably move this to a context if we have several nested components. But for the tutorial, I'm not going to bother doing that. But now let's go ahead and change our to-do card as well to have that optimistic update. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this so I don't make a typo. And then let's change the type as well to obviously make sure we have that reducer function. There we go. Now we're ready to start using the optimistic update function within our actual to-do card here. So again, same as before, we have that form action. And when we click delete, what you'll notice is here, we have that await delete to do. But just before that, what we can now go ahead and do, so we can say optimistic update. We pass it an object again, which is going to have that action. And the action type now is going to be delete. And we can just pass it through our entire to-do, as it's just going to go ahead and get the ID from that. Now, if I click the delete button, you'll notice it is instant. We notice that it's deleting immediately when we click that now. The last thing we need to do is make sure that when we have our checkbox, that is also optimistic. As I said, at the moment, there's a bit of a delay with that, and it feels a bit weird as a user. Now, for that, what we're going to do is we're going to change our checkbox here. For this, what I actually recommend is not really using the optimistic update function, and I'll explain why in a bit, and I'll show you an alternate method where we can actually use that optimistic update functionality, but I find it a bit weird and a bit hacky. So the way I recommend doing optimistic update on this is simply just using state as we normally would in pretty much any other component. So what we'll do is we'll do state, checked, set checked. We'll make this useState like so. And then we'll change this to todo.isComplete. Just making sure I import useState from React there. And then on useState, what I'm going to do is we'll just change the onCheck changed here to just say set checked and then the value. There we go. So what we're doing essentially is we're just setting the state to whether the to-do is complete. And you'll notice now that this will start being immediate as long as we change this Boolean here to actually use our checked value there. So let's change this to use our checked value. And you might also have to wrap this in a Boolean as well, as it can't convert null there. So let's wrap checked in a Boolean. And now you'll notice if we click this, it's instant, and it's not necessarily happening behind the scenes instantly, but it's showing to the user instantly. Now, that is essentially how we use useOptimistic to create, update, and delete. What I'm going to go ahead and show you just after this is a real quick way that we can actually change this checkbox to use a form action and also use that optimistic hook. You're not actually allowed to use the optimistic hook, or you're not recommended. It comes up with an error if you're not using a form action, which is why we do it this way. I'm going to show you another alternate way, which I personally don't like, which is why I've left it out of this bit. But let's commit this now as the last step there, which is step 7, use optimistic. So as I just mentioned, we're going to change this to quickly make sure that the checkbox is actually using the optimistic value. What I'm going to do firstly is delete these pending bits here, as we're not going to be using them for this section, as we don't want it to grey out once they click the complete, as this is what's going to happen. Is before, what you may have seen is when we clicked the checkbox, it wasn't doing the grey out that the delete was. That's because it's not using a form action. Now that it is, we do want to make sure that it's not flashing for the user. So we're going to change this there to todo.isComplete and get rid of essentially what we just did in the last step. Now what I'm going to do on here is I'm going to change the type of this checkbox to submit, and this is where it sort of feels a bit hacky, is we're changing the type of the checkbox to submit, as form actions only work if the type is submit or if the type isn't there at all. Now what we can do is we can change our onCheck change to essentially, let's change this to form action. And then on this form action, we actually don't need the value here, as we don't need to check this as intermediate. What we can do instead is we can change isComplete to be the opposite of what the current to-do value is, so todo.isComplete, and go ahead and save that. And what you'll notice is, as I said there, it's graying out the buttons when we click, and this is now using a form action. But obviously we can change this to add our optimistic update before it as well. And for that, what we can do is we can do action, and then that's going to be update, and then we're just going to do the to-do, and the to-do is just going to be equal to to-do, and then is complete, or is underscore complete. As I said, it's just going to be the opposite of todo.is underscore complete. Finally, let's go ahead and save all of that. And now you'll notice we are using an optimistic update, so it's immediately updating. And as I said, at the currently moment, it's graying out the second we click it, and that's because we're using that form status here. So I recommend you go ahead and get rid of that if you're using the optimistic method that we just set up there. So let's go ahead and delete that. And we should see that it starts being nice and optimistic for us using that use optimistic hook from React. So there we go. We can spam that and it immediately updates for the user. As I said, that was essentially an extra step, and I don't really like this method. I'm kind of preferring it to do it in state there, but we're still learning about this. If you know a better method, do let me know down in the comments below. As always, please subscribe to Jolly Coding, and if you have any questions, do check them out on the GitHub repo or leave a comment down below. And if you want to see more tutorials, let me know down below what else you would like to add. And as always, thank you very much for watching.